But now we go to the version of the parable in Matthew, and it takes place in a very different setting. In the Gospel of Matthew, it's near the end of Jesus' life, in Jerusalem in the days before his death. In fact, it's one day after he overturned the tables of the money changers and drove them out of the temple. And we find him not relaxing at table, but back in the streets of Jerusalem, engaged in debate with the chief priests and religious leaders who are challenging his authority to teach. In other words, the parable takes place in the midst of an argument about who has the authority to interpret the scriptures, the religious establishment or Jesus. And with that in mind, let's listen to this version of the parable. Jesus once more spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a ruler who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other servants, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized the servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The ruler was enraged, just like in the last one, but this time the ruler sent troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city." Which, by the way, the Romans did all the time when somebody would not make a treaty with them. You know, if you wouldn't decide to sort of, yes, we'll become part of Rome, they would often attack the city, burn it to the ground. This had happened to Sepphoris, which was a town near where Jesus was, near Nazareth, when Jesus was very young. So it was a well-known tactic to the people at the time. And the ruler said, "The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go into the streets, invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet." So they went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. And there's one more part to the parable which is really weird. It goes, "When the king came in to see the guests, he noticed someone there who wasn't wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And the man was speechless. So the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" I wasn't even going to read that part, but I figured I ought to be honest. So many scholars think that the differences between these two parables have to do with when they were written, the writer's intent, and the audience to whom they wrote the gospel. For example, it's thought that the author of Matthew was writing to, or perhaps in, a community that was experiencing conflict between the new Christian Jewish faith and the old traditional Jewish faith, of which those Christian Jews were still a part. Not only that, but the reference to the destruction of the city by the king's armies is thought to be a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem by the armies of Rome in the year 70. So it's happening after Jerusalem has been destroyed, wiped out. For ancient Jews and for the first Christians, the destruction of Jerusalem was a cataclysmic event. Imagine 9/11 multiplied. Imagine the total destruction of New York City or Washington, D.C., or something like that, just beyond our thinking. It was an event that shook their worldview to the core and demanded a cosmic explanation. So in trying to come up with one, both Judaism and Christianity were transformed forever. In some ways, you could argue that Christianity as we know it dated from that time because of the interpretation that had to happen around this, and Judaism too, contemporary Judaism too. So here the writer of Matthew takes a parable of Jesus about God's great feast for all people and uses it to try to explain why Jerusalem was destroyed and why the early Christian community, with its new mix of Jews and Gentiles and women and slaves, was a valid form of faith, even Jewish faith. Those who were first invited, according to the parable and the author of Matthew, had failed to respond to the prophets and to Jesus. The new Christian community might be made up of outcasts and untouchables, but they were invited to the feast too, is what Matthew is saying. They had a place at the table too, and their place was just as valid as the places of those who had come before them. It was a way of affirming the invitation of God and the acceptance of those formerly unacceptable Gentiles and Jews, women and slaves by the God of the wedding feast. In that last part of the parable in Matthew, where one of the newcomers is cast out for not having the right clothes on, is even more strange, but many scholars have pointed out, I mean, some poor person just invited off the street couldn't possibly have a suitable garment for the feast, so it just doesn't make sense. But Jesus or the writer never intended it to be taken literally again, and used the image simply to say to his own community, you too could be disinvited to the feast if you don't live in ways that reflect the invitation of God to the great wedding feast. That's what the garment represents, living in ways that you understand what just happened, and live in ways that reflect God's invitation to the great wedding feast.